stood up, screamed Allah Akbar, and then just started shooting.
A triple murder of unimaginable brutality.
This is the one case that truly screamed out for the death penalty.
There has been a tragic shooting at the Fort Hood Army base in Texas.
This enemy was within, and that's what makes it so hard.
1 week after the Fort Hood massacre, the suspect, Major Nidal Hassan, has been charged with 13 counts of premeditated murder.
He just stood up and began firing on all of us, and then taking steps and reloading and firing again, reloading, firing again.
4 men sit in solitary confinement, sentenced to die for crimes that shocked the military. One is a serial killer who terrorized military families. Another gunned down his fellow soldiers. A third murdered a mother and her children. The fourth opened fire on a crowded military base. All 4 have been on death row for decades. All 4 are still alive. Hidden within the walls of Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, lies the United States Disciplinary Barracks, America's only maximum security military prison. Built in 1875, this fortress has held some of the military's most dangerous criminals, from World War II collaborators to modern-day terrorists. But deep inside is something even more secretive: military death row. The facility itself is imposing, a castle-like structure with thick stone walls, guard towers, and razor wire. It can house up to 515 inmates, but the death row section is completely separate from the general population. These condemned men live in a section so isolated that most of the prison staff never see them. Currently, 4 men sit on military death row. Their names: Ronald Gray, Hassan Akbar, Timothy Hennis, and Nidal Hassan. Their crimes span decades and range from serial murder to terrorism, from the killing of fellow soldiers to attacks on military bases. But what unites them isn't just their death sentences, it's their existence in a legal limbo that most Americans don't even know exists. The military justice system operates under its own rules, its own courts, and its own executioner. The Uniform Code of Military Justice gives the military the power to sentence its own to death, but that power comes with a catch. Every death sentence must be personally approved by the President of the United States, not the Secretary of Defense, not the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the President himself. No president has done that in over 60 years. This creates a bizarre constitutional situation. The military can sentence someone to death through its court system, conduct all the appeals, exhaust every legal remedy, but they cannot actually execute them without presidential approval. So these men wait, trapped in a system that sentenced them to die, but legally cannot kill them. The daily routine on military death row is strictly regimented. The condemned wake at 5 a.m., eat meals in their cells, and have limited access to fresh air, usually just 1 hour per day in a small concrete yard. They can receive visits from family members, but these visits are heavily monitored and restricted. Unlike civilian death row inmates, they don't have access to extensive legal libraries or the same level of media attention that might help their cases. This creates a legal maze that would seem impossible in the civilian world. Take Ronald Gray, for example. In 1988, he was convicted of multiple murders and rapes while stationed at Fort Bragg, one of the largest military bases in the world. He's been on military death row for over 35 years, waiting for a signature from the president that may never come. The military death row is stuck in a strange place where military rules and constitutional rights don't quite line up. The people held there live in extreme isolation, often locked in their cells for 23 hours a day. They rarely get to go outside, speak with others, or even know when their case will finally be resolved. The real issue runs deeper. The military has its own justice system, separate from civilian courts, with different rules for appeals and executions, but it still has to follow the Constitution, and that creates problems. The Fifth Amendment promises fair treatment, but is it fair when the president, not a judge, has the final say on execution? The Eighth Amendment bans cruel punishment, But is it more cruel to delay for decades than to act? No president wants to answer these questions. It's easier to leave the inmates waiting than fix the system. Even the execution process is secret. Civilian executions have witnesses and media. Military ones would be private. So we're left to wonder, what's really happening behind those concrete walls? But to understand what military death row really means, we need to look at the men who live it. In the mid-1980s, Gray was an active duty soldier stationed at Fort Bragg, one of the largest and most heavily populated military stations in the world. But instead of serving his country with honor, Ronald Gray lived a double life. Between April 1986 and January 1987, Gray committed a string of crimes that are hard to comprehend. He raped and murdered 4 women. He attempted to kill a 5th, and in total, he was convicted of 4 murders, 1 attempted murder, and 8 rapes, including attacks on both civilian women and fellow military personnel. What made his crimes so chilling was his method. He stalked his victims, many of them strangers, attacked them in their homes or at night, and sometimes even returned to the scene to interfere with investigations. One of his victims, a fellow soldier named Private Laura Lee Vickery Clay, was abducted, raped, and shot multiple times. Her body was found in the woods near the base. Gray confessed to the crimes in detail during a military interrogation. He led investigators to the body of one of his victims and even described how he killed her. There was no remorse, just cold, procedural recollections. In jail, he reportedly bragged about his crimes to fellow inmates, showing a disturbing lack of empathy. What followed was one of the most high-profile military trials in U.S. history. Gray's crimes were so brutal and so extensive that the Army exercised its full jurisdiction, despite some of the attacks happening off base. In 1988, a military court-martial sentenced Gray to death. The civilian court in North Carolina later handed him 3 additional life sentences for the same series of crimes. But decades later, he's still alive. In 2008, President George W. Bush approved Gray's execution, making him the first U.S. soldier to receive a presidential death warrant since 1957.
The military intends to move forward with its first execution in more than 55 years.
The serial killer has been on death row since 1988.
Yet legal hurdles and ongoing appeals have kept him from the execution chamber. Today, more than 35 years later, Ronald Gray remains on death row at Fort Leavenworth. In the early hours of March 23, 2003, at Camp Pennsylvania in Kuwait, just days after the official U.S. invasion of Iraq, Army Sergeant Hassan Karim Akbar turned on his own unit. He systematically shut down a power generator, throwing the area into darkness. Then he hissed, "We are under attack," hurled 4 M67 fragmentation grenades into sleeping tents, and opened fire with his M4 rifle as panic erupted. 2 officers were killed, Captain Christopher Seifert and Major Gregory Stone. 14 others were injured, many with shrapnel wounds from the explosions. The attack sent shockwaves not just through the camp, but across the entire U.S. military. For the first time in a generation, a U.S. soldier had launched a deadly attack on his own unit in a combat zone. But this wasn't a moment of snap judgment. It was premeditated. In a diary recovered by investigators, Akbar had written about his growing resentment toward the military. He believed the army was targeting Muslims, and he blamed his fellow soldiers for his failures. He had been demoted, ridiculed, and increasingly isolated, and he let that anger boil over into murder. Before the attack, Akbar wrote, "I may not have killed any Muslims, but being in the army is the same thing. I may have to make a choice very soon on who to kill." Akbar's trial was swift and heavily publicized. In 2005, a military jury found him guilty of premeditated murder and attempted murder. He was sentenced to death, becoming the first American soldier since the Vietnam era to receive the death penalty for attacking fellow troops. His defense team argued for mental illness. They brought up a history of paranoia, childhood abuse, religious harassment, but none of it convinced the courts. Every appeal was denied, including a petition to the Supreme Court. Today, Hassan Akbar remains on death row at Fort Leavenworth. He's been there for over 2 decades, waiting for an execution order that can only come from the president himself. What makes this case unforgettable isn't just the betrayal, it's the timing. Akbar didn't strike in the chaos of war. He waited until his unit was most vulnerable, the night before they deployed into combat, when trust and unity meant survival. In 1985, Katie and Gary Eastburn lived in Fayetteville, North Carolina, with their daughters Kara, Erin, and Jana. However, they were planning to relocate to England for a job opportunity. Katie made arrangements to rehouse the family's English setter Dixie in the local newspaper. One man responded, Timothy Hennis, a 27-year-old Army sergeant stationed at nearby Fort Bragg. He visited the home, met Catherine, and took Dixie home with him. But here is where it gets really dark. The family's husband and father, Captain Gary Eastburn, was away at Air Force training in Alabama. On May 11th, Katie did not respond to her Gary's routine phone call, and on May 12th, a concerned neighbor and a police officer visited the home where they discovered the remains of Katie, Kara, and Erin. Katie had been stripped to the waist, raped, and stabbed 15 times. Semen was also found inside her body. Kara had been stabbed repeatedly in the chest, while Erin had been bludgeoned in the chest and back. The youngest child, Jana, survived the attack, but was dehydrated and suffering from diarrhea. Police asked around. Witnesses reported seeing a man matching Hennis's description near the Eastburn home. Catherine's bank card had also been used at an ATM after the murders, and witnesses placed a man resembling Hennis at the scene. He was arrested, tried, and convicted. In 1986, Hennis was sentenced to death. The prosecution painted him as a predator who used the dog ad to find a vulnerable woman home alone. The evidence was mostly circumstantial, but the jury believed the story. The case was far from over. In 1988, the conviction was overturned on appeal. The court ruled that graphic crime scene photos shown in court had unfairly prejudiced the jury. Hennis was granted a new trial. In 1989, he was retried, and this time, he was acquitted. The defense hammered the lack of physical evidence. The state had no fingerprints, no DNA, and no murder weapon. Witnesses changed their stories, and the jury let him go. Hennis walked out a free man. He rejoined the Army, rose to the rank of Master Sergeant, served tours in Desert Storm, Somalia, and Afghanistan. By all accounts, he lived an exemplary military life. But then, everything changed. In the early 2000s, the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office reopened the cold case. New forensic tools allowed them to retest the evidence. A rape kit collected from Catherine Eastburn's body, one that couldn't be analyzed in the 1980s, was finally sent for DNA testing. The semen inside Catherine's body was a match for one man, Timothy Hennis. But there was a problem. Hennis had already been acquitted. The Fifth Amendment protects against double jeopardy. He couldn't be tried again in civilian court. So the Army did something extraordinary. In 2006, they recalled Hennis to active duty, a legal maneuver possible because he was a retired military member. This gave them jurisdiction to court-martial him, despite the previous civilian acquittal. In 2010, Hennis stood trial again, this time in a military courtroom at Fort Bragg. The prosecution now had the one thing they'd never had before: DNA evidence, and it was decisive. The defense argued that the sex was consensual, that the DNA didn't prove murder, but the jury didn't buy it. On April 8, 2010, Timothy Hennis was convicted for the second time. He was dishonorably discharged, reduced in rank to private, and sentenced to death. He remains on military death row at Fort Leavenworth. In the late 2000s, Nidal Hassan was a U.S. Army major and psychiatrist stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, one of the largest and busiest military bases in the world. But instead of providing care to soldiers returning from war, Hassan was quietly slipping into a mindset shaped by radicalism, isolation, and hate. On November 5, 2009, Hassan walked into the Soldier Readiness Processing Center, a medical facility where troops prepared for deployment to Iraq and Afghanistan, and opened fire. He was armed with a high-powered FN-57 pistol and a .357 Magnum revolver. Over the course of just 10 minutes, he killed 13 people and wounding over 30 more. Among the dead was a pregnant soldier. Hassan didn't just attack strangers. He targeted fellow service members, people he worked with, patients he treated, brothers and sisters in uniform. What made the massacre so horrifying wasn't just the body count, it was the betrayal. Hassan was a trusted officer, a doctor, a man sworn to protect the very lives he took. And yet, during his own court-martial, he admitted he carried out the attack intentionally. He claimed he was defending Taliban fighters, that by killing U.S. soldiers before they deployed, he was preventing them from harming Muslims overseas. Hassan had been growing more radical for years. Colleagues reported that he made alarming statements in lectures. He spoke admiringly of suicide bombers. He exchanged emails with Anwar al-Awlaki, a known al-Qaeda recruiter. Red flags were everywhere, but no one stopped him. When the shooting was over, Hassan was shot and subdued by military police. He survived, but the bullet severed his spine, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. In 2013, a military court convicted Hassan of 13 counts of premeditated murder and 32 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to death, the first U.S. military member to receive the death penalty in more than 50 years.
A military jury at Fort Hood, Texas today sentenced Army Major Nidal Hassan to death for killing 13 people and wounding more than 30 in a 2009 attack.
Since then, Hassan has launched appeal after appeal, citing religious discrimination, mental health, and due process violations. All have failed. In 2023, a military appeals court unanimously upheld his conviction and sentence. And in 2024, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear his final appeal. With all legal avenues now closed, only a presidential signature stands between Hassan and the execution chamber. But military death row doesn't just haunt the men who sit in it. It casts a shadow far wider, reaching into the lives of victims, families, guards, and the justice system itself. Start with the victims' families, which have been waiting decades for a justice that never arrives. In Ronald Gray's case, families have been waiting over 35 years. Some of the original loved ones are gone now. Parents who died before seeing the sentence carried out, children who grew up without answers, and spouses who waited a lifetime for closure that never came. Mary Eastburn, the mother of Catherine Eastburn, murdered alongside her 2 daughters by Timothy Hennis. She lived long enough to see Hennis convicted not once, but twice. She died in 2016, never having seen the man who destroyed her family face execution. Her life became a relentless fight for justice, a fight that outlived her. Then there are the families of the soldiers killed by Hassan Akbar. They lost their sons, brothers, husbands, soldiers asleep in tents when they were ambushed by one of their own. And now, they live with the knowledge that their killer is still alive, still fed, still receiving medical care, still protected by the very institution their loved ones served in. And what about the condemned men themselves? Whatever crimes they committed, they're now locked in a strange purgatory, sentenced to die, but stuck in a system that refuses to follow through. Ronald Gray has been on death row for more than 3 decades. He's watched other inmates die of old age, seen guards retire, watched the world change from behind concrete walls, all while waiting for a decision that never comes. The guards who oversee military death row describe it as unnerving. These men were condemned. They know they're supposed to die, but when or if? Some guards say that the moment an inmate learns their final appeal has failed, there's relief in their voice. Not because they want to die, because at least then they know. Until that point, it's nothing but uncertainty, a psychological limbo worse than death itself. As we move further into the 2020s, military death row is reaching a crisis point. The 4 men currently held have been there for a combined 80 years. Their cases have cost millions, and their victims' families are still waiting for justice that may never come. Is that justice, mercy, or just delay disguised as decision? This outcome satisfies no one. Families feel betrayed. The condemned live in limbo, and the Constitution is quietly ignored through inaction. The next president will inherit this problem. So far, no one has solved it. And meanwhile, in a quiet corner of Fort Leavenworth, 4 men wait for a decision that may never come.